The ink on the deed was barely dry when Cressida Holt realized her father had not looked at her once during the entire signing. The solicitor's office in Dunmore smelled of tallow and old leather, and the single window faced a wall, so the only light came from a lamp on the desk that threw everyone's shadows long and strange across the floor. Her father, Bernard Holt, sat in the good chair, the one with arms, and scratched his name across the bottom of a contract that had been drawn up without her knowledge, presented to her that morning with the same tone he used when explaining the weather. She stood behind him, close enough to read every clause. The arrangement was tidy and cold. Cressida Maeve Holt, age 22, to be given in marriage to Aldous Vane, Earl of Kestmore, in exchange for the cancellation of debts totalling £9,000 and a further £200 paid directly to Bernard upon the ceremony's completion. £200. That was what her father had negotiated for her above the debt relief, less than a decent horse. Bernard set the quill down, flexed his hand, and said to the solicitor, "Not to her, she ought to be grateful. The man needs a wife. She'll have a title and a roof." Cressida said nothing. She had spent 6 years saying nothing, while her father spent through her mother's inheritance, borrowed against the house, borrowed against the furniture, borrowed against the name. She had watched the Holt family's modest respectability dissolve like salt in water, and she had kept the household accounts and filed her father's court documents, and read every page of every lease and loan agreement that crossed his desk, because someone had to, and he no longer bothered. She knew the precise shape of the hole he had dug, £9,000. She had been counting it for 2 years. The solicitor gathered the papers. Her father poured himself a glass from the decanter on the credenza. Cressida walked out to the street and stood in the October air and let the cold settle into her lungs until the feeling passed. Not grief exactly. Something older and quieter than grief. The understanding that she had always known it would end this way. That she had spent years making herself useful in the hope that usefulness would be enough to keep her safe. And she had been wrong about that, the way she had been wrong about very little else. She went home and packed one trunk. She packed her instruments last, wrapping each one carefully in flannel, because they were the one thing in that house that belonged entirely to her. 12 years of midwifery, first as her aunt's apprentice and then on her own, had given her a set of tools that her father had never thought to pawn, because he did not understand their value. He understood the value of silver and furniture and daughters. He did not understand the value of a woman who had delivered 431 children and lost only 9, in a county where the usual rate was closer to 1 in 6. The carriage from Kestmore arrived the following morning before Bernard was awake. Cressida carried her own trunk to the door. The driver did not speak. The road north took 3 hours, climbing out of the lowland farms into a landscape that grew wilder and heavier the further they went, the trees pressing closer to the road, the sky settling lower, until the carriage turned through a pair of stone gates and rolled up a drive banked on both sides by yew hedges trimmed to the height of a man. Kestmore Hall sat at the end of that drive like a sentence waiting to be finished. 4 stories of dark stone, long windows, and a silence so complete that Cressida could hear her own breathing when she stepped out of the carriage. The grounds were immaculate. Not a fallen branch, not a weed, not a blade of grass out of its designated place. Everything about the estate had the quality of a room that had been set in order and then never lived in again. A steward named Fitch met her at the door with a bow so precise it seemed rehearsed. Behind him, a young housemaid with worried eyes curtsied and introduced herself as Pole. "Your ladyship will want to rest before meeting his lordship," Fitch said. Cressida had not yet been married. She was not yet anyone's ladyship. She did not correct him. Pole led her through a hall lined with portraits, family faces going back 4 generations, and in several of them the same young man recurred, fair-haired, sharp-shouldered, with a quality of alert attention in his painted eyes that made him look as if he were about to speak. There was a name on the frame of the largest portrait, Fletcher Vane. She had heard that name before. She had heard it 2 years ago, in a coroner's report that had come through her father's magistrate office, sealed and marked for the files that she had been the one to sort and shelve, because Bernard's hands shook by mid-morning and his clerk was useless. She remembered every word of it. She had a memory that worked like that, had worked that way since childhood, storing documents and details with the involuntary precision of a press plate receiving ink. She had never decided to memorize things. They simply stayed. Fletcher Vane, younger brother of Aldous Vane, Earl of Kestmore, had died 14 months ago. Cause of death: drowning. Location: the Kestmore Mill Pond. Verdict: accidental. Her father had signed the verdict without comment and shelved the file. She had thought nothing of it at the time. She thought of it now, standing in the entrance hall of Kestmore, looking up at the painted face of a young man who had been alive 14 months ago and was not alive anymore. The drawing room was at the end of a long corridor, and the door stood open. Cressida felt the air in the corridor change before she reached it. A slight drop in temperature, a stillness that was different from the stillness of the rest of the house. Then she stepped through the doorway and saw him, Aldous Vane, Earl of Kestmore, stood by the window with his back to the room. He was tall, with the kind of build that suggested he had once been broader and had shed the weight through some long attrition. His hair was very dark and needed cutting. He did not turn when she entered. She noticed, before anything else, that he was standing in a particular way, his left hand pressed flat against the wall beside the window, his weight on his right leg, as though the window itself were something he needed to brace against. After a moment he turned. His eyes were grey, and they found her immediately, directly, clearly, without any of the drifting effort she would have expected from a man with the condition his household described. His sight, she had been told by the solicitor, had been failing since his brother's death, a palsy of the optic nerves brought on by grief that left him capable of only blurred and indistinct shapes at a distance of more than a few feet. She had been told he could not read, could not identify faces clearly, could not navigate an unfamiliar room without assistance. His gaze was resting on her face with an attention that was neither blurred nor indistinct. She said nothing. She filed the observation in the same place. She kept everything that did not add up, which in this house was already filling quickly. "Miss Holt," he said. His voice was lower than she had expected, with a quality of careful economy to it, as if he rationed words the way other men rationed coin. "The ceremony is at 2. I trust the journey was acceptable." She curtsied. She did not know why she curtsied to a man who could ostensibly not see her do it. Force of habit, perhaps, or something more deliberate. The chapel was cold and grey-stoned and contained 4 people beside themselves: Fitch, Poll, the vicar, and an older woman seated in the second pew with the posture of someone who had once held a military rank. This was Aldous' mother, the Dowager Countess Millicent Vane, and she watched Cressida from the moment she entered with eyes the same shade as her son's, and approximately twice as sharp. The vows were brief. When the moment came for the ring, Aldous' hand found hers without a moment's hesitation. Not the searching, uncertain reach of a man navigating by approximation, but the direct, unhesitating movement of a man who knew exactly where her hand was. She said nothing. She let the ring settle onto her finger and said nothing. After the ceremony, Aldous walked her to the base of the main staircase, where Fitch was waiting. "You have the south suite," he said. "I keep to the north, dinner at 7. He paused. Not the pause of a man who had lost his thought, but the pause of a man choosing very carefully between 2 different things he might say. Then he turned and walked back down the corridor, and his footfall was confident and even, and he navigated the turn at the corridor's end without touching the wall. Her rooms were generous and clearly prepared with care. A fire laid, fresh flowers in a green glass jar, a shelf of books arranged alphabetically. A work table beside the window, larger than she needed, with good light and a locked wooden case sitting on top of it. She recognized the case before she crossed the room. She opened the brass clasp and found a full set of midwifery instruments, better quality than her own, newly purchased, and beneath them a note in a hand she had not yet seen. "The county has needed a skilled midwife for 2 years. You will not find your work unwelcome here." She read the note twice. Then she set it down on the table and stood very still for a long moment, because a man who could not see could not have selected or labelled those instruments. Someone had known exactly what she was before she arrived. Someone had prepared for her specifically. And that meant she had not been chosen randomly, or merely for the convenience of settling a debt. She had been chosen for a reason. Dinner was formal and mostly silent. The table was long and candlelit, and the dowager sat at one end with the calm authority of a woman who considered silence her native language. Aldous sat across from Cressida in the middle of the table, and his eyes in the candlelight were focused and steady, and when she reached for the salt, they moved to follow her hand with a smoothness that had nothing accidental about it. The dowager, Cressida noticed, watched all of this without comment. When the plates were cleared, Aldous stood and excused himself with the minimal courtesy that seemed to be his natural register. Cressida sat alone with the dowager and a decanter of port for 9 minutes before she spoke first. "The instruments in my rooms," Cressida said. "Did you select them?" Millicent looked at her over the rim of her glass. "I helped." She paused. "You are not what I expected." "What did you expect? A quiet girl who would be grateful?" Cressida said, "I am not quiet and I am not grateful. I'm here because my father sold me, and I intend to understand why your son bought me specifically." The dowager's expression did not change, but something in the set of her mouth shifted fractionally toward what might have been approval. She stood, set her glass down, and said, "Ask him." Then she left the room with that same military carriage and the precise click of heels on stone. Cressida found him in the library. She had gone looking for something to read, because the alternative was sitting in her room on her wedding night, listening to the fire, and she had made a promise to herself at 14 that she would never let any situation reduce her to simply sitting and waiting for someone else to decide what happened next. The library door was half open, and the room inside was dark, except for the fire, and she stopped in the doorway because Aldous was there. Standing before the fireplace with his back to the door, holding a small leather notebook open in both hands. He was reading it, not feeling the cover, not running his fingers along the spine. Reading. His eyes moved across the pages with the controlled, leftward track of a man who had been reading since childhood, and his expression as he read was something she had no name for yet, a kind of concentrated grief, like a man reviewing a letter he has memorized, but keeps returning to, because each reading takes him back to the moment it arrived. She recognized the notebook. She had not seen this one before, but she recognized the type. Her father had kept a similar one, personal jottings, case notes, things a magistrate wrote down to remember but could not file officially, things that were true but inadmissible. The floorboard creaked beneath her foot. An old house, and she had not found the solid boards yet. Aldous closed the notebook in one movement and set it face down on the mantel. His expression, by the time he turned, was as composed as she had seen it at the ceremony, controlled, unhurried, giving away nothing. "Forgive me," he said. "I thought I was alone." "I was looking for a book," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Come in. There is correspondence that wants attending to." She came in. He handed her a stack of estate papers, tenant letters, a drainage dispute, a complaint from the northern farm about the mill road, and she read them aloud in the voice she had used for 6 years in her father's office, steady and clear, with the trained accuracy of a woman who had learned that slurring a date or a number could mean the wrong person went to jail. When she reached the drainage dispute, she stopped. "The map attached to this letter is wrong," she said. "The drainage easement runs along the eastern boundary at 40 chains from the mill pond, but the deed of grant I saw filed 2 years ago in Dunmore puts it at 32. Someone has redrawn the map." Aldous was very still. "How certain are you?" "I have a particular memory." She paused, choosing the words carefully, because she had learned not to lead with this, because it made people uncomfortable in ways that were rarely useful. "Documents I have read, I retain them. The exact wording, the measurements. I read your brother's coroner's report. When it came through my father's office 14 months ago, I remember every line of it." The silence in the library was so complete, she could hear the fire breathing. Aldous set his glass down very carefully on the table beside him. He said, and his voice was level in the way that required effort, "The verdict was death by drowning. Accidental." "Yes," she said, "that is what the verdict said. But the notes preceding the verdict, the examining physician's preliminary report, which I filed before my father, sealed the final document, described bruising on Fletcher's arms inconsistent with the drowning. It described the water depth at the point of recovery as inadequate for a man of his height to have been submerged without assistance. It described a pattern of injury that the physician flagged for further investigation. She paused. My father closed the investigation before that investigation occurred. The room was very quiet. Aldous' hands, she noticed, were resting on the arms of his chair, and they were not steady. He was not trying to make them steady. He was letting them be what they were, and she understood this as a form of trust, offered to someone he had no particular reason to trust yet. "You read that report," he said. "I filed it. I read everything I filed. I read it, and 14 months later a solicitor arrived at my father's office with a marriage contract and my name on it." She looked at him directly. "That was not coincidence." No, it was not. He met her eyes. His were clear and focused, and carrying something that had been under pressure for a very long time. He said, "I spent 6 months after Fletcher died trying to understand what had happened. I found the physician's preliminary notes through a contact at the medical college, not the sealed ones, but a duplicate set the physician had kept for his own records, because he was uneasy about the closure of the investigation. Those notes named 2 parties who had been on the Kestmore grounds the morning of Fletcher's death. The first was a groundskeeper who has since died of a chest complaint. The second was a woman who had been visiting for a fortnight under the pretext of a social call, and who had a financial arrangement with your father that neither of them had disclosed." She felt the cold arrive in her hands before she had processed the sentence fully. "Who?" "Her name is Rosalind Drake. She is a widow of considerable means and considerably elastic ethics, and she is currently pressing a claim of prior engagement against me through a solicitor in Edinburgh, supported by a letter she says I wrote to her the winter before Fletcher died." He paused. "I did not write that letter. She thought of her instruments chosen and laid out and waiting for her. She thought of her name on a contract her father had signed without looking at her. She thought of the drainage map that had been redrawn, the sealed report, the closed investigation, and the £9,000 that had bought her father's silence and her hand in a single transaction. You needed a wife, she said, who had already read the truth, and whose testimony about a sealed report would not require producing the sealed report. He said, I needed a wife Rosalind Drake could not legally displace. And I needed a woman who had read what I could not get unsealed, who could speak to what those documents contained without requiring the originals. There is only one person in England who had access to both the sealed preliminary notes and my brother's coroner's file before they disappeared from Dunmore's records. My father sold me to the woman who had your brother killed, Cressida said. And you bought my evidence and my name in one transaction. Aldous was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I bought the one person in this country whose memory cannot be sealed or misplaced. But I should like to earn more than your testimony, if you will allow it. She did not answer immediately. She set the drainage dispute letter down on the desk and pressed her palms flat against the surface and breathed. The house was quiet around them. Outside, the October wind was working through the yew hedges on the drive, and the sound of it was like the sound of water, and she did not look at the notebook he had set face down on the mantel. There is more, she said. It was not a question. His hands were still not steady. He said, Fletcher found the letter Rosalind was preparing for me, the forged engagement, 3 days before he died. He found it because he was that kind of person, alert, dogged, constitutionally unable to walk past something that didn't add up. He confronted her about it. I was in Edinburgh at the time. He sent me a letter. It arrived the day after the news of his death. He pressed his mouth closed for a moment, and she watched him take the grief and set it somewhere he could still function. He was 24. He was the better part of everything good that remained in this family after our father died, and he walked into that confrontation alone because he thought he could reason with her, because he believed most people were, at their foundation, reasonable. The fire had burned down to coals. The room was very still. Cressida stood up and crossed to his chair and took his hand. His grip, when it closed around her fingers, was not the controlled, calculated grip of a man performing careful movement for an audience. It was the grip of a man who had been holding a very heavy thing alone for a very long time, and had just found someone willing to take the other handle. She will not walk away from this, Cressida said. I will not allow it. He pressed his forehead against her hand, and they stayed like that for a long while, and the only sound was the settling of the coals and the wind in the dark outside. They planned until 2 a.m. The Northern Counties Winter Assembly was held every year at Aldermere House. 11 days hence. Every family of consequence in the region attended, including Aldous, confirmed with the flatness of a man reporting a weather pattern; Rosalind Dray, who came every year in grey silk and accepted the attentions of 3 different solicitors, and smiled at everyone with the particular confidence of a woman who has ensured that every dangerous document is either destroyed or under her control. "She believes the report is sealed," Cressida said. "She believes your father sealed it permanently and that no copy exists." Cressida sat down at her work table and picked up her pen and began to write from memory. Not from notes. She had no notes, but from the same involuntary mechanism that had stored 431 deliveries. The precise measurement of every drainage easement in Dunmore County and the full text of a physician's preliminary report that she had read once, 14 months ago, on a Tuesday afternoon when the rain was coming sideways against her father's office window, and she had been the only one present because Bernard was at his club. She wrote the report in its entirety: the bruising, the water depth, the angle of injury, the physician's language verbatim, the date, the time, the signatures, the physical observations that had been suppressed before they could reach a verdict. She wrote until her hand ached, and then she wrote more. And when she was finished, she had 6 pages in her own hand that contained more evidentiary weight than anything Rosalind Dray had thought to destroy. The days that followed reshaped the household in ways Cressida had not anticipated. During the day the mask held. Aldous navigated the house with the careful, slightly effortful movement of a man relying on proximity and memory rather than clear sight, and the servants orbited him with the solicitous attention of people who had been managing around a limitation for over a year. She read his correspondence to him in the morning room each morning, and anyone passing in the corridor would have heard only the even voice of a new wife fulfilling a necessary role. But in the evenings, after Fitch had done his last round, and Poll had banked the kitchen fire, and the house had gone to its particular deep quiet, the door to the north study closed, and the performance stopped. Aldous moved through the room without the careful hesitation, pulling ledgers from the shelves himself, pouring his own brandy, spreading documents across the desk, with the organized speed of a man who knew exactly what he was looking for and where everything was. He sat close to her at the desk, close enough that she was aware of the warmth of his shoulder near her arm, and he looked at the pages with her, his grey eyes moving across the columns with the same alert focus she had seen on his face in the library that first night. She had to recalibrate. She had spent the days talking to a man who appeared not to notice her expressions, and now she was talking to one who noticed everything, and the adjustment was significant. She found herself in the middle of explaining a discrepancy in Rosalind Dray's property records. She had obtained them through Aldous' Edinburgh solicitor, and she had looked up and he was watching her face instead of the ledger, and she lost her place entirely and had to start the sentence again. He did not mention this, neither did she. On the 4th evening he showed her the forged engagement letter. It was written in a feminine hand on quality paper, and it was addressed to Rosalind from Aldous, and it professed a commitment to marriage that was warm and specific and entirely convincing, and it was dated 18 months ago. She held it under the candle and looked at the letters carefully. Then she said, "This was not written by the same hand that signed the 3 estate letters I read Tuesday." He was watching her. "How can you tell?" "The descender on the lowercase g. In this letter it loops closed. In the estate letters it hooks open. Also the crossbar on the T. The one in this letter is written at a slight upward angle, and the ones I have seen from you are level or very slightly down." She set the letter on the table. "I have read your correspondence for 4 days. This was written by someone who studied your hand carefully and reproduced it with great skill, but they reproduced it from a limited sample, and they did not notice the descenders." After a long moment, Aldous said quietly, "Aldous." She looked up. "Not my lord." His voice was dry enough that she recognized it as what passed, for him as a kind of humour. "If you are going to dismantle a forgery by identifying the descender on my G, you might as well call me by my name." She went back to the letter. She was aware, without looking up, that he was not looking at the letter anymore. His mother, the dowager, was a presence Cressida had not yet fully mapped. Millicent Vane occupied the east sitting room in the mornings, conducting correspondence with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been managing large amounts of information for a very long time, and she watched everything from the position of a woman who has learned that the best vantage point is the one everyone forgets about. One morning at the end of the first week, she intercepted Cressida in the corridor outside the breakfast room. "I have been watching my son for 14 months, Millicent said without preamble. "Since Fletcher died." She paused. "He has not sat at the library fire in the evenings since that first week. He used to read there with Fletcher. They had a habit of it, going back years. I heard the fire laid there last night," Cressida said. "I came in looking for a book on the first evening. We ended up reading estate correspondence." Millicent looked at her with the grey eyes she had given her son and said, "He laughed yesterday morning in the corridor outside the breakfast room. Pole dropped a serving dish and he caught it, and he laughed." She paused. "I have not heard him laugh in 14 months. She walked away without waiting for a response. Cressida stood in the corridor, with her hand pressed flat against her sternum, and had no idea what to do with that information. So she filed it in the place where she kept everything that she could not yet explain, and went to the morning room to read the Post. Rosalind Dray arrived 5 days before the assembly. She came in a hired carriage with 2 companions and a quantity of luggage disproportionate to the stated duration of her visit. 4 days as a courtesy call on a new countess. She was perhaps 40, copper-haired and precisely dressed, and she moved through Kestmore's entrance hall with the practiced ease of a woman who had already decided she would be comfortable here. She had green eyes and a smile that operated independently from anything happening behind it. She was attentive to Aldous at dinner that evening, with the specific attention of a woman testing the tolerances of a structural beam. She moved his water glass 6 inches to the right without comment and watched him reach for it. She rearranged the placement of the salt cellar and the pepper mill and watched him navigate them. She dropped her glove on the floor beside his chair and did not ask for it back, and watched to see whether he looked down. He did not look down. He reached for the water glass in the wrong place, corrected, found it. He asked Fitch to refill the salt cellar without looking at it. Rosalind's smile settled into something more satisfied. Cressida watched this from across the table and ate her roast pheasant and said very little. Then Rosalind turned to her. "How charming," she said, with the bright warmth of a woman who has just won a hand of cards, "that his lordship has someone to manage his household affairs." She tilted her head in Cressida's direction. "You were a midwife, I understand, before the marriage." She let the before carry its full implication across the table. "Tell me, was that a voluntary occupation, or simply the best available option for a magistrate's daughter with no prospects?" The table had 4 guests besides themselves, a baronet from the next county, his wife, and 2 of Rosalind's companions. Every face had turned, the way faces do when a conversation sharpens suddenly into something dangerous. The heat in Cressida's chest was immediate and real. She felt the word magistrate's daughter land with the precision of someone who knew exactly where to place it. She felt the word midwife, and she felt the pause around prospects. And she absorbed all of it the way she had learned to absorb the things her father had said, and the things his creditors had implied, and the things that small county society had permitted itself to think aloud, in rooms where she was considered furniture. She set down her fork. "I delivered 431 children, Cressida said. Her voice was even and carried without effort, including the baronet's youngest, on a February night 2 years ago when the road was frozen and the nearest physician was 12 miles away." She looked at Rosalind across the candlelight. Midwifery requires, among other things, the capacity to remain calm when something is going badly wrong, and to know the difference between what a situation appears to be and what it actually is. "I have found those skills useful in a variety of settings." She picked up her fork again. The baronet's wife exhaled. Sir Hugh Darley was looking at Cressida with an expression she recognised as reassessment. The dinner recovered around her, slowly, conversation resuming in other directions. And Cressida ate her pheasant and said nothing further, and thought, underneath the surface calm that she had been practising since she was 16, that she had perhaps 4 days before the assembly, and that 4 days was enough. That night she cried. She went to her room and locked the door and sat on the floor with her back against the bed frame and let it come, because she had learned that the feelings did not diminish by being refused entrance. They only accumulated, and it was better to meet them directly and on your own terms than to have them arrive uninvited in public. The shame came first, the specific shame of having been reduced to a category in front of people she would have to face again, not magistrate's daughter, not midwife, but the implication beneath both words. Someone whose value is practical, secondary, transactional, someone who came with a price. She knew the price. She had read the contract. She sat on the floor for a long time, long enough that the candle had burned down by a third when she heard the knock. It was 2 taps, then quiet. The way a person knocks when they are uncertain of their welcome, but are knocking anyway. She opened the door. Aldous stood in the corridor without the careful hesitation of a man performing limited sight. His eyes, in the dim light, were very clear and were carrying something she did not yet have words for, except that it was not pity, because she had extensive experience with pity, and this was not its shape. "May I come in?" She stepped back. He came in and went to the window and stood looking out at the grounds with his hands behind his back, and they were quiet together for long enough that the quiet stopped being uncomfortable and became something else. "I owe you an apology," he said, "for what she said tonight, for the fact that I was sitting 3 feet from her and could not answer it without dismantling 2 months of preparation, and letting her know that I could see her clearly and had been watching her test me all evening." "I know why you couldn't," Cressida said. "I know that you know. That is not the same as it being acceptable." They were quiet again. Outside, the yew hedges were black shapes against a sky that had no stars. Then he said, "My brother used to come down to the library on the evenings I could not sleep. He would bring the chess set, and he would not ask what was wrong. He would simply set up the board." He paused. He was 24 years old, and he had a kind of fundamental optimism that I never possessed and could never account for. He believed that most things were solvable and most people were salvageable, and that the afternoon was always a better time to make a decision than the morning, when everything looked worst. Cressida did not speak. She had learned, from 14 months of sitting with women in the final stages of labour, that silence at the right moment was not absence but presence, and that some things needed to be said in a space that was not being filled. "I sent him the documents I found through the medical contact," Aldous said. "The physician's duplicate notes, the ones that contradicted the official verdict. I sent them to him because he had more contacts in this county than I did, and because I trusted his judgment, and because I believed that if anyone could find the thread that would unravel this, it was him." He read them. He identified Rosalind's name from the notes about the morning of Fletcher's death. She had been present on the grounds, and her name appeared in the physician's own witness list, which had been removed from the sealed report but preserved in the duplicate. "He wrote to me that he was going to speak to her. He said he was sure there was a reasonable explanation. He said he would be careful." He paused. "The letter arrived the same afternoon as the news that he was dead." The room was very still. "He was 24 years old," Aldous said again, and his voice on the number fractured very slightly, a fault line that opened and closed in a single breath. He believed there was a reasonable explanation. He walked toward her alone in that belief, and Rosalind Dray is not a person who tolerates reasonable explanations. And I was in Edinburgh, and I was too late by a day and a half. His hands were not steady. He did not move them. He let them be what they were, on the windowsill, visible, and Cressida crossed the room and took them both. And his grip was not careful. It was the grip of a man who has been carrying alone something that was designed for two. "She will not leave this county a free woman," Cressida said. He pressed his forehead against their joined hands and breathed, and she held on, and the house was quiet around them, and the window was dark, and she thought of Fletcher at 24 with his chess set, and his fundamental optimism, and the letter that arrived a day and a half too late, and she thought that the least she could do was hold on until the work was finished. The Aldermere Winter Assembly was held on a Thursday evening in a hall that smelled of candle wax and fresh fir boughs. 312 people filled the room to its formal capacity, every county family of standing either present or represented. Sir Hugh Darley and his wife were there, the local magistrate, 2 representatives of the county court, and Aldous' Edinburgh solicitor, a careful man named Mr. Price, who had arrived that morning and spent the afternoon in the Kestmore library with Cressida's 6 pages of reconstructed physician's notes and a very precise understanding of what the evening was for. Mr. Price was in the outer vestibule with 2 county constables by 8 o'clock. Rosalind arrived fashionably late in grey silk, as predicted, and moved through the assembly with the ease of a woman at the centre of a social world that she had spent 20 years constructing and maintaining. She positioned herself near Aldous within the first quarter hour, taking his arm with the familiar confidence of a woman exercising a prior claim, angling herself between him and Cressida, with the practiced grace of someone who had done this kind of displacement before and found it effective. She produced the forged letter from her evening bag at the moment of maximum witness, addressing the room with the carrying voice of a woman accustomed to being listened to. A prior engagement, she said, documented and signed, predating the current marriage. She presented it to the Assembly's host, Lord Aldermere, with the serenity of someone handing over something they expect to be uncontested. Then she turned to Cressida. "I'm afraid," she said, with the specific warmth of a blade finding a joint, "that the validity of your marriage will need to be reviewed. I am sure you understand." Cressida stepped forward. Her hands were steady. Her voice, when she spoke, was the voice she had used for 14 years in rooms where steadiness was the difference between a good outcome and a catastrophic one. "The descender on the lowercase g in that letter loop's closed," she said. "Aldous Vane's does not." She paused to let that land, and watched 312 people suspend their conversations. The T crossbar in this letter angles upward, his angles level or slightly downward. "I have read 7 years of his correspondence, and I have read your correspondence with my father. And the handwriting on that document is yours, practiced for long enough that it is very close, but not long enough to correct the descender." Rosalind's smile remained in place. "A new wife defending her position," she said, her voice carrying to the back of the room. "How unfortunate," Cressida continued. "On the 17th of September last year, Fletcher Vane was found drowned in the Kestmore mill pond. The coroner's verdict was accidental drowning. That verdict was delivered after the examining physician's preliminary report, a report that I read in full in my father's office before it was sealed, was suppressed. That preliminary report described bruising on Mr. Vane's forearms inconsistent with drowning. It described the water depth at the point of recovery as insufficient for a man of his height to have submerged without assistance. It described a pattern of injury that the physician flagged for investigation. That investigation was closed before it began. The report was sealed by order of my father, Bernard Holt, who at the time of its sealing held an outstanding financial arrangement with the woman standing in front of me. The assembly room was so quiet that Cressida could hear a candle guttering somewhere near the eastern wall. She turned to face Rosalind directly. "Fletcher Vane found documentary evidence of a forgery you had prepared, and he told you he intended to bring it to his brother's attention. He was 24 years old, and he believed you would respond reasonably, and he met you on the mill pond path alone, and 2 hours later he was dead." She let that settle. The physician's report that would have demonstrated this is sealed in Dunmore. I have reproduced it from memory in 6 pages of my own handwriting that are currently in the possession of Mr. Price, solicitor, who is in the vestibule. Rosalind's smile did not waver. It simply ceased to reach any part of her face except the teeth. "Fletcher believed there was a reasonable explanation," Cressida said. "I do not." Aldous set down his cane. He had been holding it in his right hand throughout the entire evening, and he set it down now against the wall beside him, with a small click that was enormously loud in the silence. He straightened. He turned to Rosalind Dray, and he looked at her. Not the drifting, slightly off-centre gaze that the county had witnessed for 14 months, not the careful approximation of limited sight that had kept her circling instead of fleeing. His eyes found hers with total and unambiguous clarity. "My brother," Aldous said, "came to you alone, because he believed in reasonable explanations. He stood and looked at her and let everything he had been carrying for 14 months exist in his face without the mask over it. I have not shared that belief since the afternoon his letter arrived, but I have shared everything else of his I could find to keep." The room did not breathe. Rosalind looked at his eyes. She looked at the clarity in them, at the 14 months of careful and deliberate deception looking back at her from a face that had finally stopped performing, and the colour left her face with a completeness that made the grey silk she was wearing look warm by comparison. The constables entered from the vestibule. The room parted for them in the absolute silence of 312 people who understood that they were witnessing something that would be discussed in this county for the next 30 years. Mr. Price presented the constables with Cressida's reconstructed notes, the forged engagement letter with the technical analysis of the handwriting appended in Cressida's own hand, and a supporting affidavit from the physician who had written the original preliminary report and who had been located by Mr. Price in a practice in Northumberland, where he had been troubled for 14 months by the manner in which his findings had been disposed of. Rosalind Dray was escorted from the Aldermere Winter Assembly at 9:43 in the evening. She did not speak. She walked between the two constables with the particular controlled posture of a woman who has decided that her face is the last thing she will concede. And the doors closed behind her, and the assembly remained silent for a long moment after they closed. Then Sir Hugh Darley began to clap, slowly and deliberately, and the sound spread through the room. The consequences arrived quickly and without ceremony. The sealed coroner's file was unsealed by order of the county magistrate. Bernard Holt's replacement, since Bernard had been removed from the bench within a fortnight of the assembly, permitted to retire quietly to his sister's house in the Maritimes at Cressida's request, because she had spent 22 years watching him fail at nearly everything, and did not see the utility of watching him fail at prison as well. The physician's full preliminary report entered the evidentiary record. The forged engagement letter was assessed by a documents examiner and confirmed as fraudulent. Aldous stood before the assembly before it dispersed that evening, and said, in the voice that she had come to understand he used when he was not performing anything, "My wife is the finest mind I have encountered, and the steadiest hand I have ever had the privilege to work beside, and I can see her with perfect clarity, and I intend to spend a considerable time making that clear." The dowager, seated near the front of the room with her glass of Madeira, nodded once, with the expression of a woman confirming an arithmetic result she had already worked out for herself. The drive back to Kestmore was dark and quiet. The carriage lantern swung on its hook, and the countryside was invisible beyond the windows, and Aldous had left the cane in the vestibule at Aldermere and had not retrieved it. He sat across from her in the dark, and for a long while neither of them spoke. Then he leaned forward. The lantern light caught the angle of his face, the sharp line of his jaw, the grey of his eyes resting on her steadily. "I brought you into this because I needed what you carried," he said. "Your memory, your testimony. The particular accident of your father's filing system that meant the one person in this country who had read the right documents was also the one person in this country desperate enough to accept a stranger's ring." She said nothing. She waited. "I am asking you now," he said, as something different. "Not for evidence, not for a legal strategy." He paused, and it was the pause of a man who has spent 14 months in the controlled economy of grief and is attempting something that does not fit inside that economy. "I am asking whether you will stay because you choose to." She looked at him across the lantern light, at the face that had held a mask over itself for so long that the effort of it had worn grooves she was only beginning to map, at the hands that had not been steady on more than one occasion and had not tried to hide it. "You laid out those instruments," she said, "before I arrived. You chose them specifically. You wrote the note yourself. You knew what I was before you offered for me, and you prepared for who I actually was rather than who you needed me to be." He said nothing. She crossed the space between them and took his face in both hands, the way she had learned to hold a face that needed to be held without being controlled, and he closed his eyes and leaned into her palms and was still. "You told me the truth on our wedding night," she said, "when every other person in my life had built their arrangement on some version of a lie." She pressed her forehead against his. "I have been making this choice since then." He put his arms around her and held on, and the carriage carried them home through the dark. 16 months later, Kestmore Hall was not the same house Cressida had arrived at in October. The difference was not in the stone or the grounds. Those remained exactly as they had been, immaculate and ordered. but in the quality of the air inside, which had changed in the way air changes when a house begins to be inhabited by people who have decided to inhabit it fully rather than move through it carefully. Her work table had been moved to the library at her request and Aldous' insistence, so that it sat beside his desk in the good window light, and their papers occupied the same surface in the organised confusion of two people who understand each other's systems well enough to work within them simultaneously. She continued her midwifery practice. The county had needed a skilled midwife, as the note had promised, and she had delivered 63 children in the 16 months since October, and word had spread as it does in the way of practical things, and she had more referrals than she could manage alone, which was a problem she was addressing by training 2 young women from the village whose attention and aptitude reminded her of herself at 17. The dowager had moved her embroidery to the library on Thursday afternoons, which everyone understood to mean that she intended to be present for whatever was being discussed, and no one had the standing to suggest otherwise. On a morning in the 2nd February, Aldous found Cressida at her work table with a new letter from Mr. Price. She had been reading it for several minutes before he came in from the garden, and he understood from the way she was holding it, both hands flat on the surface, that it contained something that required careful handling. He sat down in the chair across from her. She passed him the letter. The trial date for Rosalind Ray had been set for the spring assizes. Mr. Price required the Countess of Kestmore's testimony, which she had already confirmed she would provide. He enclosed, secondarily and marked for her eyes alone, an additional note. In the preparation of the evidentiary record, a third party had been identified. Not Rosalind, not Bernard Holt, a name that appeared in correspondence between Rosalind and a third person, in letters intercepted by Mr. Price's contacts in Edinburgh, letters that suggested Rosalind had not acted alone on the morning Fletcher Vane walked toward the mill pond. Someone had known she intended to stop him. Someone had confirmed to her that Fletcher had the documents and intended to use them. Someone had told her when and where he would be. That person had not yet been found. Cressida read the note twice. Then she looked up through the library window at the garden, where a pair of sparrows were conducting an argument in the bare branches of the ash tree, and she thought of Fletcher at 24 with his fundamental optimism, and the letter that arrived too late, and she thought of the 63 children she had delivered in 16 months, and the 2 young women in the village who were learning to notice the things that didn't add up. Aldous was watching her. His grey eyes in the February light were very clear. She picked up her pen. There was more work to do, and if you want to know who told Rosalind when Fletcher would be on that path, stay close. That answer is coming.